Welcome to The Real News. I'm Hassan Ghani in Islamabad. We've just finished filming an exclusive interview with Dr Ghairat Baheer, Chief Negotiator and Head of the Political Wing of Hizb-e-Islami, one of the three main factions fighting against the US and its allies in Afghanistan. He claims peace talks with the US have failed to materialise because of dishonesty on the part of the American side. And while he said it wasn't his place to talk about the group's militant activities due to his position as a politician rather than a fighter, he did say the popularity of groups fighting against NATO was growing among Afghans on a daily basis. We asked him about human rights, democracy and whether peace is a realistic prospect. Whatever you think of Hizb-e-Islami and its leader Gul Rahman Hekmatyar, the words of Dr Baheer are worth listening to because his party is likely to be a major power broker in post-US Afghanistan. Here's what he had to say. Why are you fighting with the US, with NATO forces in Afghanistan at the moment?
No, first of all, I'm here to talk to you about the political side of the issue, and I'm political in charge of the party. So I would request you to not to touch those things which are not related to my field. But anyhow, in general, I would say that war was always imposed on Hizb-e-Islami. The party was not formed for fighting. It was formed in Afghanistan when there was a peace in Afghanistan during King Zahir Shah's rule in Afghanistan. And later on, when the Soviet invaded Afghanistan, when there was a communist regime imposed on the Afghan people, we were forced to resort to a weapon and to fight. Same thing is happening right now, and American invaded Afghanistan, although they have their own interpretation of their environment in Afghanistan. But the superpowers always have their own justification for their aggressions. The Soviet Union, when they invaded Afghanistan, they said that we are here at the invitation of the Afghan government. We are here to defend democracy. We are here to defend progressive elements of the country. And they used to call those who were fighting against the Soviets that these are rebels. So the same thing is happening now with the Americans. They say that we are here to fight against Al-Qaeda, against Taliban, against international terrorism.
But in terms of politics then, there are now talks, at least talks about talking. Where do you see that going?
I think issues should be discussed on the negotiating table. But again, for negotiations, we have our own principles, which means that the negotiations should be honest ones, durable one, lasting one, and also everyone should come up with a package. Hizb-e-Islami was the only party which had proposal for the solution of the Afghan conflict throughout this crisis. I personally led the delegation to Kabul several times. We had several rounds of talks with the Afghan President Karzai, with peace high councils, and other relevant parties. I met him personally, very high-ranking American officials, including David Petraeus, General Allen, and His Excellency Mr. Crocker, the ambassador. So we had several rounds of talks, but unfortunately we have not reached to any kind of concrete solution so far.
But at least there seems to be a willingness to talk on all sides. Why do you think that is? Why now?
Unfortunately, this is something very common that everyone is trying at the beginning, military might, military power, and when they come to the conclusion that that is not working, war is not solution to the conflict, and then they go to the negotiating table. The key for the solution of Afghanistan lies with the Americans. If America wants to solve the Afghan problem through peaceful means and negotiations, I think they can do it. But still, I believe that Americans, for some reason, they are still going for the military options, and they think that they can win the war. or at least to be apprehended, and so that they can get more advantages in the negotiating tables.
So from what you're saying, does that mean that the talks that are being talked about in the media are not progressing as well as they could?
Things are stuck, actually. There's no progress as far as negotiations is concerned. With regard to Hizb-e-Islami, I would say very clearly that we have stopped our negotiations with the Kabul government and also with the Americans, because we came to the conclusion that they were not honest, they were not serious, and they were using negotiations for some other gains, just as a cover and just as a public opinion deception. I would put it in this way. One of the reasons that we stopped our negotiations with the Afghan government and also with the American was the signing of the strategic accord between Afghanistan and the United States of America, and which was clearly paving way for the security pact or security accord between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which means that Americans are planning to have a military basis in Afghanistan. So we believe that the presence of Americans under any cover, under any pretext, ultimately means the continuation of war in Afghanistan.
So is that's a precondition for talks? Is it that there must be a full withdrawal of US forces, or at least that has to be on the table?
Yeah, actually, I think you put it in the right way. It's not a precondition, but I think even the American withdrawal should be the main part of our negotiations.
This time last year, in an interview, you said that following the US withdrawal, it's quite likely that Afghanistan will again fall into civil war. Is that an opinion you still hold today?
No, I believe that before even the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, there should be a consensus developed between all Afghan stakeholders. It means that before the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, all Afghans should agree upon a system that will accommodate everyone according to their share, their presence, their demography, their influence in the Afghan society. But if there is no consensus developed before the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, or if foreign interventions are not stopped totally in the internal affairs of Afghans, then naturally we are going to enter to another catastrophe.
I get the feeling that when you talk about foreign interventions, you're not just talking about NATO, you're perhaps talking about Afghanistan's neighbors as well.
No, we'll put it in generally, foreign interventions, but usually even if there's any kind of interference from the neighboring countries, it's spearheaded by the superpowers.
The Taliban clearly believe elections are completely un-Islamic, and you were talking about consensus has to be developed at least before the Americans leave in order to avoid civil war, but surely there's a bridge or a divide that can't be crossed there when you have a very strong force like the Taliban who will not accept elections, and then you have groups like yourself on the other side who want elections following the US withdrawal. How are you going to cross that bridge?
First of all, we believe that election is part of Islamic Sharia. This is our understanding of Islam. So we believe in elections. I think this is the only way to solve the problem. With regard to Taliban, I'm not here to speak on behalf of Taliban, but I think there's a lot of changes in Taliban's approach towards the Afghan issue as well. There's a lot of flexibility in their approach. It means that neither Taliban nor Hizb-e-Islami will compromise on the principles, which is not compromisable. But I think as far as the system is concerned, if Taliban are engaged and we all talk to them and they are somehow part of the political network, I think finally they will agree to the system with the main concept of elections, but the modality will be different from Taliban. One can compromise as far as the modality of the elections are concerned, but I think in general, in principle, Taliban would also agree to it.
I want to talk now about the US occupation. The US says that it's brought development in women's rights, democracy, and it's trying to bring stability and security to Afghanistan. I guess you don't agree with that.
I told to Ambassador Crocker in a very frank manner, and he appreciated my frankness. I told him that, look, the British ruled this Indian subcontinent, and with all their colonial behavior. But if you ask people of the subcontinent, they will tell you that railways, airports, universities. The same thing was happening in Afghanistan when the Soviet invaded Afghanistan. That resulted in almost 1 million martyrs. We had hundreds of thousands handicapped as a heritage from that invasion of the Soviet Union. But with all those bitter memories and bad memories, we have several things in Afghanistan which will remind Afghans of the Soviets' contribution to Afghanistan. Mahipar, Salang Highway, and Technicum. There's another big university, Polytechnic, and so many other very big projects that one can see that these were built by the Soviets. But with the Americans, unfortunately, I think when they are leaving Afghanistan, they will be leaving behind their military brigades and prisons in Afghanistan. Even with regard to democracy and with regard to elections in Afghanistan, they were not successful even in that regard. Afghan government or Afghan system is now number 2 as far as the corruption is concerned. The Americans themselves admit that fact. Now it's almost 12 years passing that American came to Afghanistan, but still Afghan soil is burning. Fighting is going on there. And the resistance was not restricted. It was not crushed, but it was spreaded. It used to be in the south. Now it's spread to almost all over the country. Naturally, when you are fed up with someone, then you return to the other one, to the other side.
Now, going back to the reasons for the invasion, of course, the official premise was a reaction to 9/11. But there are growing numbers of people who doubt the official narrative of what happened in New York. Do you believe Al-Qaeda was responsible?
Whoever was responsible, but the wrong people, the wrong country was attacked, and the wrong people paid the price of 9/11. The official statistic of the killing of the 9/11 was somehow between 3,000 and 4,000. But hundreds of thousands of Afghans were killed and tortured. And the same thing has happened to Iraqis. And I think a very huge price was paid by the Muslim Ummah, I will put it in this way.
In terms of Al-Qaeda, the US says that at least the leadership, Gul Rahman Hekmatyar, has been working with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Is there any truth to that? No,
it's not true actually. Hizb-e-Islami is an independent entity. Its history goes to 70s, and it was a party before Al-Qaeda was not born. Taliban were not born there actually. Hizb-e-Islami was there, and I would say very categorically that we have no relations with Al-Qaeda.
There are reports in the Western media, though, of Gul Rahman Hekmatyar praising Osama Bin Laden.
No, it's something very natural, actually. Osama Bin Laden was praised by all Muslim Ummah, especially by Afghan Mujahideen leadership. He lived with the Afghans for decades, and he was part of the Afghan resistance against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So it's something very natural that I think there's a sympathy as far as Osama Bin Laden is concerned. It's not necessary that one should agree with the general opinion or the general public opinion of the United States of America with regard to certain personalities.
And what about the Taliban? How are relations with the Taliban? Do you have any relations? Are you in contact with them, or are you working completely separately in the dark?
We have our own contacts with Taliban, sometimes discussions with the Taliban, but we don't have any kind of formal agreement or formal alliance with Taliban.
Mm. I'd like to talk about human rights in a bit more depth now. You've obviously had a pretty horrifying experience yourself at the hands of the US military. You were held for 6 years or more than 6 years without charge or trial in US custody, including US black sites, CIA black sites, where the rule of law just does not exist. One of your close staff, Gul Rahman, was abducted with you and later died in CIA custody after freezing to death. How would you describe your experience briefly in the hands of the CIA?
I was in total for 2 years. I was in isolation. Isolation means that I couldn't see light. I was locked in my room for 24 hours. Just once or twice, sometimes I was taken to the toilet. And most of the time my toilet was a small bucket which was accompanying me 24 hours. And most of the time my hands were locked to the wall. And believe me, after 2 years, I got so used to darkness that after 2 years, when the American soldier came and he wanted to turn on the light, I was resisting, and I was telling him that turn off the light, turn off the light. He said that, why? I said that, no, I cannot tolerate it, I cannot afford it. I think in a very short time, in a period of 2 months, I lost 30 kgs of my weight. And I was just left with my skeleton. And there were a lot of problems, actually, I went through. And you have just mentioned my colleague, Gul Rahman. He was my driver. We have been told, and we have actually read it in the internet and also in very important newspapers, including New York Times, that he has been killed. But still the Americans are not admitting the facts, and we have approached ICRC, and we asked ICRC to talk to the Americans that at least they should formally acknowledge his death, so that the family is a little bit consoled, and they have their own religious rituals. And so far his family, including his wife, his 4 daughters, his ailing and aging mother, is waiting, and they are living in a status of uncertainty.
Now when you sit across the table from US ambassadors or US diplomats and talk to them, you know, in the negotiations that were, or the talks that were taking place earlier, how do you feel having gone through that experience?
Actually, I was asked the same questions when I was in custody, that doctor, in case if you get released, so what will be your impression of Americans? What has happened actually through my detention experience, that I tried my best not to let any kind of hatred be developed in myself against Americans as a people. I knew my status among Afghan society, so I was expecting that the time will come that I will be released, and then I will be again a public figure, and I will be in a position to play a role for the future of Afghanistan, and that role is there now. I am chief negotiator on behalf of Hizb-e-Islami, and if I had hatred towards Americans, that wouldn't allow me to carry out that mission. And when I'm talking to the Americans, if Americans come forward with peaceful solution, which will end this agony to my people, I think I will be more than happy to talk to them and to sit with them and to tolerate them.
After keeping you in detention without charge or trial for more than 6 years, and then releasing you without ever having seen a judge or any legal process, what did they say to you?
The last time that I met them in Bagram, They say that we had 135 meetings, including today's ones. So almost every session was 1 hour, sometimes 2 hours. And we had no barriers between ourselves. There was no need of interpreter. We used to talk directly in English. And those meetings were called interrogation, but they were not really interrogations. Sometimes it was just an exchange of views. They wanted to benefit from my experience, from my information, from my political background. And even I gave them a lot of written stuffs about Afghanistan, advising them what to do in Afghanistan in order to solve Afghan's problem. So we had a lot of deliberation and negotiations. And the last words that I was hearing from them were that we are sorry, wrong person, in the wrong time, in the wrong place, and we couldn't find anything against you. And you were a peaceful man. You have never been part of the militancy in Afghanistan. But it was too late, although I was not convinced what they were saying. But I was not in a position to, argue at that time. And
do you think that through these policies of indefinite detention, often innocent people are caught up in them, or the drone strikes, which often kill bystanders, innocent civilians, are the United States creating new enemies for themselves unnecessarily?
Actually, I used to tell them that, look, these detention centers that you have made in Afghanistan, don't call it detention centers, call them factories of enemies' productions. Actually, the Americans, by doing so, by treating people in this way, by arresting people, they are creating actually enemies by themselves. They're producing enemies by themselves. This is why their own statistic says that those who are released in different stage from detention centers, 70% of them goes to the mountains and fight against Americans. Especially when your dignity is insulted, your religion is insulted, your culture is insulted. It's something that you cannot forget it. I think the same thing is happening with the drone attacks. If American thinks that they have killed X and Y from Taliban, then this is the end of the story. It's not the end of the story, actually. To replace X with Y, Y with Z in Taliban ranks, it's not a very big job, actually. But this drone technology is disturbing the whole country here, the whole system here. You have been listening to the radios and TV since yesterday that this is the main and the burning topic of today here in Pakistan.
Still on the topic of human rights, clearly the US has a very poor record of human rights in Afghanistan, but human rights weren't particularly great before the US arrived in Afghanistan. Do you see them deteriorating further after the US withdraws from Afghanistan?
No, I believe that if Americans really leave Afghanistan and let Afghans to determine their own destiny, I don't think that we will have a violation of human rights in Afghanistan. And the reason is very clear, actually. We are Muslims, and there's a very great respect for human beings and Islam in our religion. In Afghanistan has a 5,000 years history. It's not a new entity on the planet. So we had our own system, we had a peaceful country, and people were very civilized people. The Soviet Union, when they were defeated in Afghanistan, when they withdrew from Afghanistan, it was a physical withdrawal from the Soviet Union, but they continued their intervention, their interference in Afghan affairs.
But the predominant governments towards the end, I mean, it was Hizb-e-Islami, and then the Taliban came to power. Neither of those two groups had any connection with the Soviets. In fact, if anything, they had connections previously with Pakistan as a proxy, and at the back, they were in contact with the US during the Soviet jihad.
No, actually, Hizb-e-Islami was not given the chance to rule Afghanistan, although it was the most popular party. It was the backbone of the Afghan resistance. This is what I'm saying, that there was a conspiracy hatched against Afghans, that they wanted that Hizb-e-Islami should never be in power. And this is why actually they have designed, we call it Peshawar Accord, and that accord, the power was distributed in a way so that Hizb-e-Islami is cornered, and Hizb-e-Islami is not given its due role in Afghan future system. It's a long history, but I would again repeat myself that the bad experience of 1990s were not, it was not the creation of Afghans, but it was the creation of the superpowers and some great powers and some regional powers here.
I'd like to go back to women's rights. I mean, the US said it's improved women's rights in Afghanistan. It's an important issue for our audience. How do you see women's rights progressing or degrading after the US withdrawal?
Actually, the interpretation of women's rights is something very important. What do you mean by women's rights? If the interpretation of women's rights is women's dignity, its rights in rule in the society, and its contribution to the society, I think that is existed in Islam, and Islam in our religion has a very great respect for women. But sometimes, unfortunately, women's rights is just interpreted in wearing Western style clothes, or appearing on public stages without taking into consideration your religious and cultural values. Sometimes women's rights is interpreted in this way. But anyhow, we, as far as Hizb-e-Islami is concerned, I told you that even during jihad period, we had the schools for girls, we had universities for girls, and women were given a very big share in our political activities. I am representing Hizb-e-Islami, and I have got two doctors. They are two daughters. They are medical doctors, and the third one is in third year medical college. I think the same thing is happening with almost every member of our party. So it's just a matter of definition of the women's rights. How do you define women's rights?
But of course, you're one party of two or three factions that are quite powerful or will be quite powerful in post-US occupation Afghanistan. And again, the impression that we get in the West is that under the Taliban rule, girls' schools were closed down. As somebody who's watching from the side during Taliban rule, what was your impression?
No, actually, the schools were not closed, but there were some restrictions, and those restrictions were somehow hard, and it was interpreted as if the Taliban are not allowing girls to go to schools and universities. But I heard myself from Taliban representative in Paris when he was attending Paris conference, Mr. Shahabuddin Dilawar from Qatar. He came from Taliban's office from Qatar. And he was very clear on women's rights in Afghanistan and girls, women education in Afghanistan as far as Taliban are concerned. He was very clear, and he was putting in a very clear manner that they have no objection to women education and the women's role in Afghan society. But again, they were putting their own it's not their own conditions, but I think it's generally even that would be our conditions, that one should contribute or work within that legal framework, Islamic framework, which is not contradicting with our religion, with our culture, with our social values. I think it's something that should be respected by the Americans. Why the Americans should expect from Afghans to be as Americans. Afghanistan is Afghanistan, the United States, United States. Why we are not imposing our own system on Americans and the Western world, our Islamic system? I think the Americans also should respect our own way of life and our values, our culture, our tradition, in our political system.
Afghanistan has been in a constant state, almost constant state of war for many decades now. Do you realistically see peace, long-term peace, as a prospect that we can see anytime soon in Afghanistan?
First of all, I would tell you that I think Afghan nation has been created by God to be the toughest nation of the world. What we have experienced for the last almost 3 decades, I think no other nation can afford it, tolerate it. We went through very difficult times, and still we are going through a very miserable situation. I think all Afghans can afford it and can tolerate it, and we are tough people. This is why we are telling to the Americans that if this kind of experience continues for another decade, we can tolerate it, but it will be not tolerable for the Americans themselves as well. But anyhow, we are looking forward for urgent solution of the Afghan crisis, and we are looking forward to have a peaceful Afghanistan, prosperous Afghanistan, and to have a normal life like other human beings have it in the world. And that will be, of course, in respect to all international laws and norms and regulations.
Dr. Ghairat Baheer, thank you very much for joining us on the Real News Network.
I am very grateful to you as well. Thank you so much. Welcome.